Okay, Matthew 12. We have been discussing Matthew 11. I think we spent, 4, maybe even 5 weeks on Matthew 11. We're going to try not to spend quite that long on 12, but, we just have to see how it goes. But the funny thing is, and we had a conversation, I don't remember if it was last week or the week before, where when we're reading the Bible, sometimes we make new discoveries. We see things we hadn't seen before. And I saw something that I hadn't seen before this morning when Brian was bringing his lesson on John 4. And it ties into what we talked about in Matthew 11, but it also ties into what we'll see later in Matthew 12. Not today, but later. But I want to bring it to your attention because to me it spoke loudly. If we just go, and I'm a little off topic, but I just wanted to bring this to you. John chapter 4, where Brian was this morning, and they're talking about the Samaritans. Jesus at the well and stayed a couple of days with the Samaritans. Notice what it says. Let me find it right quick because I don't have it written down. It's not in my notes. Not that helped last week. Being in my notes didn't. I'm having a little competition here.
I was just going to do my own little stuff.
I like it. That's fine. No, John 12, I'm going to say, John 12, John 4, long about verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. Verse 40. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them. He stayed 2 days. Notice verse 41. Because of his many works and wonders? No. Because of his words, many more became believers. Contrast that with Matthew 11, where he's saying, woe to all you towns who have seen the works and the wonders, and you still refuse to engage. You still refuse to listen. He didn't even have to do works and wonders for these Samaritans, did he? In John 4, because of his words, because of the rationale that he laid out for them, they willingly believed. And yet, here he is in the thick of things in Capernaum, the people around him. He's done all these many great wonders and they still don't believe. So that just struck me, that contrast between the Samaritans' willingness to engage in just the normal conversations that Jesus had and the Jews who refused to engage even after having experienced all these wonderful miracles. And we will get to that again in the middle of Matthew 12 where they're going to say, give us a sign. And Jesus says, another sign, these people. But how interesting. I had never really caught that before, but the Samaritans, because of his words, believed. I thought that was fantastic. Okay, Matthew 12. Now, I'm going to read a little bit, but then I'm going to just kind of step back, and we're going to spend most of today in the Old Testament, talking about a few things. And then we'll engage in the New Testament as well. But let's read Matthew chapter 12. I'm going to read verse 1 through about 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some of the heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. He said, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Wow, there's a lot in that. But we're going to step back and we're going to talk a little bit about this thing called Sabbath. And I know a lot of you have already dealt with this, you've already studied Sabbath, but I want to draw out a little bit on this Sabbath so that we can put this in a better context. So let's start with, what does the word Sabbath mean? Shabbat in Hebrew. Shabbat. Okay? A lot of people think that. It actually doesn't. What it means is rest or cessation. But it does sound like 7, doesn't it? I thought that too for a long time. Shabbat means rest or cessation. What's the origin of Shabbat? Sabbath.
God rested on the seventh day.
There we go. A lot of people think that the origin of Sabbath day is the law, is the law of Moses that God gave to Moses for the Israelites. It goes way beyond that, or it precedes that, I should say. All the way to creation. If we were to read in Genesis 2, actually Genesis 1, we read all about creation, at least the first go-around. It repeats in chapters 2 and 3, but in chapter 1 we read about creation, and then he finishes the first 6 days, and then chapter 2 starts. Chapter 2 begins, this is Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the 7th day, he Shabbat. He rested. 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. That's the beginning of the idea of Shabbat. Okay? Especially in the Jewish mind. Okay. So that's where it begins. Now, we see it come up again before the law is ever in place. Now, when I say the law is in place, where do we ever think of as the law was given? Exodus. Exodus 20, Mount Sinai. Before they ever get to Mount Sinai, we see this idea of Sabbath come up again. If we go to Exodus 16, if you want to flip over there, I'm going to read it. Exodus 16, let me tell you about what's going on here. The people were moaning and grumping because they're starving in the wilderness. And so God says, I'll tell you what, I will send you birds in the evening, and I'll send you this thing that we eventually call manna in the morning. And so he does this, and he gives some instructions on how this, what we call manna, should be collected. So in Exodus 16, I'm going to just start in verse 21. I was looking to see where's the verse. It's interesting, this I say what we call manna. We don't actually know why it was called manna, but we know that it's very similar to a word called what is this? Or the definition is, what is this? And so we wonder if when they walked out and they saw it, they said, what is this? And by goodness, that's what we're going to call it. So they regularly ate, what is this? And I think it's interesting, Moses' wife must have had 101 ways to cook manna or something, because that's what they ate for years. All right, so, sorry, I just had to say that. Exodus 16, verse 21. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. Now that in and of itself would have been amazing, just to see that happen. And to see enough of this, what is this, on the ground. It must have looked like snow, because it was enough that every Israelite had this omer. They could eat an omer a day. So there had to be, and I don't know, I didn't check to see what an omer was. Does it say? Okay. 6 pounds. Yes, I see that. No, actually, an omer is 3 pounds. Twice that is 6 pounds. Yes. Yes.
Could there be a parallel here with money or material things? And God gives us, when He gives us enough, but He doesn't make us rich, He's still providing for us, but we have to keep trusting, because we don't have so much put away in the cars or the bank that we feel we don't need to ask him to take care of us. Because
I love that. I wasn't going there at all, but absolutely, that makes so much sense. In the same way that God provided manna, he said, hey, don't get more than you need, because I'm going to keep providing. Trust in me that I will keep providing. In the same way that blessings come to us today. We shouldn't have the mindset of have more than I need. Sometimes he does bless us with more than we need, but we shouldn't have the mindset of that, because then we turn away from God and we don't rely on him or trust in him for the blessings that we do have. And we have to be good stewards of the blessings that he brings us. And kind of the good stewards of the manna, you do what's right with the manna, because he's going to say here that some people tried to hold it over to the next day and it got maggots. Okay, so let's read that part. Let's start again at 16. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer, which we have found out is about 3 pounds, for every person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. Shocker, right? They didn't pay any attention, and they tried to keep it over until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Can you imagine the smell in a camp of all these people trying to hold it over to the next day? Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. Now, here we go. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers, for each person. And the leader of the community came and reported this to Moses. And he said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Shabbat, a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever's left and keep it until tomorrow morning. So you're not going to open your door tomorrow morning and see the stuff on the ground. It's just not going to be there. So gather what you need for today and tomorrow. Tomorrow's the 7th day. And not only gather it, but cook what you need to fulfill today and fulfill tomorrow, so that you're not burdened with the cooking tomorrow. Because tomorrow is a sacred day, it's a holy day, and it's a rest day. Okay? So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is the Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, there will not be any. So we see this idea of Sabbath happen before the law is ever given. So this is an important concept in God's mind. So we're going to stick to that here in just a second. Sabbath is very important to God, not just because it's a legal law. Okay. I think I actually had a few more. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Duh. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why the 6th day he gives you the bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. It was important to God to rest, to cease after creation. Because he was tired? No. But there was an important thing there that he wanted to also transfer or convey to humanity. Because, and we'll get to this, but we need it. We'll talk about this in a minute. We need it. And he knows that. Okay. So that was before the law. But then we get to the law. The Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, we say. And I believe, have I mentioned it before? I think I might have mentioned it before. A lot of people think the 10 Commandments were the 10 Commands. I don't think they were. I think they were the summary of the commands that God gave, of the regulations or rules that God made. In that culture, and we do it today, but in that culture, when you made a contract, a legal contract with someone, you didn't have the entire contract that you took home. You had a summary of the contract. Both parties got a summary of that contract, and both parties kept it. In a lot of ways, we do the same thing today. Both parties in an agreement usually keep a copy of the contract. But what happened is there was a legal requirement and a contract, a commitment, a covenant between God and the people of Israel that had a lot of stipulations. And a lot of those stipulations are detailed in the rest of Exodus, some of Leviticus, and again in Deuteronomy. So we see that, the number of regulations far exceeds the 10 on the tablets. But the tablets were the documentation. The tablets were the covenant that you signed and I signed. And that's why God's part of the covenant, remember, the part of the one of the stones was put in the ark. Okay, that was God's version. He kept that part, his version of the covenant. And then Moses kept the other in the tent of meeting. So both Israel and God had their copy of the summary of the covenant. So I believe what we see and what we experience in the Ten Commandments is the summary of the ways of being that God is trying to line out. It is not the 10 commandments. It's the 10 summaries of the types of commandments that were offered. That's my thinking. I just want to lay that out there. So, when Moses comes down off of Mount Sinai, he brings these 10 commandments, the stone, the tablet, the summaries of the commitment. Well, one of those statements of summary in Exodus 20, and it's actually interesting because this one gets quite a lot of time. I can imagine trying to chisel this out on a rock. Okay? The first one you get, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Israel. You shall have no other gods before me. That's pretty short. You shall have no other gods before me. The second one, don't make for yourself an image in the form of anything. Don't make graven images. We're familiar with that one. The third one, don't misuse my name. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. And then the fourth one, and this is the fourth one that closes out a perspective of relationship between God and man. The rest of them is the perspective of relationship between man and man. So the fourth one that designates the relationship between God and man, remember the Sabbath. This is verse 8, Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. I could spend quite a bit of time talking about that word holy. But basically it's the opposite of blasphemous. The word blasphemy is basically across the threshold. Take it outside, that which is common. Don't make both my name, he says my name up there earlier, but the Sabbath should not be common. You shouldn't engage in the activities that are common to your everyday life, to your original sustenance, working, cooking, those kinds of things. So, the Sabbath day, the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your male, nor your female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and in that is blah, 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 and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Again, chapter 31. God is hammering this home. Chapter 31, verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. How many times can he say that, right? Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Oh, now we're getting serious. Okay? Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. For 6 days work is done, to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it. I circled that word because in the New Testament, when it gets to the Sabbath, it is not a day of celebration. It's a day of, oh my goodness, do we have to do this again? Because of all the requirements and restrictions that the traditions made around it, it made it laborious to have a Sabbath. But here God says, this is a time of celebration. Celebrate it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. God is very insistent that the Sabbath take place. And I'm 35, Exodus 35, there's one of these. Yes, more Sabbath regulations. Just the first few verses of chapter 35. Moses assembled the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things the Lord has commanded for you to do. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest for the Lord. Whoever does any work on it is to be put to death. Do not, you remember the elevator we talked about? And the button that lights up? Okay. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Well, what if it's cold? Okay. Lighting a fire here in this context refers to cooking. Okay. Don't light a fire to cook. Because cooking should have been done the day before. Okay. Those of you, especially women, know cooking is sometimes laborious, right? Okay. And I can remember the Rice Krispie commercial. Rice Krispie candy commercial. She comes out, she has to put flour all over her face and everything. She comes out, oh, that was such work. And everyone thinks, oh, Mama's awesome because she spent all this time in the kitchen. But no, seriously, cooking is a lot of work sometimes. Especially like they had a lot of people in their homes. You're not just cooking for two. That's right. You didn't have as convenient of cooking back then. So the fire mentioned here is really talking about cooking. Now, there might have been other instances of fire that it might address, but principally, he's saying don't cook. Okay? I didn't look into that, but what I would do if I were them.
Get a big fuzzy blanket.
Absolutely. I'd get a big fuzzy blanket. Go cut the wool off the sheep. And what often happens today, we have ultra-Orthodox Jews, even today, who follow these assumably explicitly. But what they will do is they will start all of this stuff the day before. And so if you need a fire, that fire will be built and built up the day before so that it continues throughout the day and they don't have to continue to feed it and whatnot or build it from scratch. So in ways they've worked it so that they aren't starting a fire, don't light a fire. Well, what happens if the fire already started? Okay, you can put a log on it. Okay, right, planning ahead. But just think about this as cooking, principally. That's really where this is headed. Sabbath itself, the day of Sabbath. When does it start? Sundown Friday. What they will often say is when the first 3 stars appear in the sky. Okay, when the first 3 stars appears in the sky, it starts on Friday night. And it goes through until the first 3 stars appear on Saturday night. That's your day. That's your Sabbath day. Why does it start so early and so you have evening and then you have day instead of day and then night? I'm sorry?
That was their calendar, wasn't it?
That was their calendar. The Jewish day always started around 6 o'clock the evening before. Go back, well, you don't have to. I'm going to take you back to Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, you notice the days that are set out for creation. And I'm sorry, but that in and of itself is about a 6-month study. So we're not going to go there today. But notice this. Let's just take the first day. Verse 3. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish calendar, in the Jewish thinking, the day began in the evening. And so you had evening and day, and then the next evening began the next 24-hour period, the next day. So that's why Sabbath starts when the first 3 stars appear, generally speaking, on Friday. Okay. What else? Covered that. Numbers. Do I have that next? Oh, I don't. I have Ezekiel. Let's go to Ezekiel. Let's see what Ezekiel has to say. Ezekiel 20. This is more about the commands. Ezekiel 20, verse 12. No, it's more the same. Also, I gave them, God is talking through Ezekiel, says, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between us, so that you would know that I, the Lord, made them holy. So there's something there about God's idea of relationship in the Sabbath. Okay? So we're starting to get this idea, this thought, and we're going to talk about it in just a sec. What is so important about the Sabbath? Why does God care so deeply about this idea of the Sabbath? Okay, hold that thought. Numbers 15. And you guys thought that I wouldn't cover all these verses very fast. Numbers 15. We actually see this thing exemplified where someone did not stop working on the Sabbath, and the penalty was played out. Numbers 15:32. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it wasn't clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, that man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as the Lord commanded Moses. Well, he had said that, penalty was death if you don't keep it. But was this, well, they knew him. They didn't know what to do with him. Yeah. Because he broke the law. And they're like, Moses, what do we do? But think of it this way. He didn't just break the law. There was a mentality. There was a thinking that went into his actions. It wasn't that he just arbitrarily broke the law. Oh my goodness, I broke the law, and you die. There was something intentional here. He knew what the law was. He should have known what the law was intended for. And yet, he still went out and did it. Now, was need or necessity a part of this? It doesn't say. Was he freezing cold and he needed to go gather wood? It doesn't imply that. And what Jesus says later, I think, would suggest that that's not what the condition was. Okay? When God enacts a punishment, he doesn't enact a punishment because of an outward action. God enacts a punishment because of an outward action that starts with an inward attitude. And I think that's exactly what we see here. There was an inward attitude. I would even maybe go so far as to say a rebellious attitude. It doesn't say that, but the context and everything that I read about it suggests that might be what we have here, is a rebellious attitude toward God. well, I need to do this, and who's God to stop me from doing this? Yes, sir.
There is a mindset that anyone can fall into, certainly unbelievers do, but filter what they see through the idea of, what if this were men doing this to other men? Well, they don't have any right to do that. But it can be as simple as it's God. And God has the right to do anything He wills, and it's always good. If we keep that mindset in mind, then we don't think of this as harsh, but at first reading it sounds like a terrible punishment.
Right.
Always the questioning of God's authority.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Questioning God's authority. It's a double-bladed sword there. Double-bladed sword. I absolutely agree. And when we think of this as it's God's, because of who He is and how He is, God has the right and eventually the will to judge us all. And He can make a judgment on any one of us at any time in our life. And if we let Him be the decider, then it's much more easy to swallow. However, the other side of that sword is there are some people who, in the name of God, take it upon themselves to enact a certain kind of justice. And they think they're doing the will of God, or they're giving God the credit for the misbehavior that they have. So we have to be cautious of that too. But absolutely, God is God. And we read the book of Job, and God says to Job, "Were you around when I created all of this? Were you the one who, look at my storehouses. Did you build these storehouses?" And Job's like, "Okay, I get it. I understand you're God." And what God does can't be questioned, shouldn't be questioned. And that point is well made. I also caution that we sometimes use it as our own excuse. And I do appreciate that they went to Moses and they said, "Hey, we heard what you said, but we want to make sure that what you said was what we ought to do." And can you imagine being that man's brother? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. So my mind always goes to, there was some inward rebellion that was exposed in the outward practice. And that's what was going on here. What we see later, and I didn't write that up here, but what we see later, the Jews did away with, in a large part, the whole Sabbath day practice. They weren't keeping the Sabbath. There were also not just Sabbath days in a week, but there were Sabbath years that were required. There were years of Jubilee, which was also a Sabbath year. There were ways that God put into the political and legal affairs of His community so that, one, people could be refreshed, and two, society kept its equality, one might say, so that no one became too poor and no one became too rich, and everyone was reliant on God. Everyone understood their relationship with God. And the land was refreshed. He put in these requirements so that the land itself could be refreshed. In fact, that's one of the reasons that the Babylonian captivity happened. We could read about it in Chronicles, where the land itself had not been refreshed for years. And so for every year that it had not been refreshed, they were going to be in captivity. So they were in 70 years captivity, and it allowed the land to be refreshed. Okay, won't go there. Actually, I think I touched on that some time ago when we talked about the intertestament period. So Sabbath was a big deal. Why does God care about the Sabbath? Let's just talk about that just a smidgen. We're not going to even finish a page and a half of notes today. Why did God care so much about the Sabbath that He was even willing to put people to death? He wanted people to be refreshed. Let's think about that. One of the things that I think Satan uses most effectively is distraction and constant obligation. Okay? We're always doing something. We always have something to do. We never have time to stop and meditate, stop and think, stop and live, breathe in God. Because the minute we have a moment of rest, oh, there's something else to do. That is one of Satan's greatest tools. Satan loves that. He doesn't even have to work. We do it to ourselves. We become so distracted by engaging in the world around us, and God says, no, have some time, because in that time you can think of me. You can be refreshed from your daily activities. You can, say again? You think about Him. You think about each other. And you can rebuild that relationship that you may have with or that may be weakening with your spouse or with your kids, because you're out in the field all day. You don't see your spouse. You come in, you're exhausted, you eat. She's cooked all day and wrangled the kids. It's just, ugh. A lot of people don't, yeah. Well, and in society today, it used to be, 50 years ago, were stores open on Sundays? No. There was a natural respect for a day of the week, and in our culture it's Sunday, where you had that time to be refreshed, to be replenished. You couldn't shop. You weren't allowed to shop. The stores weren't open. And not only does that force you to stop, but it also allows the employees to stop. Okay? So we're in this, whether we believe it or not. So that's one of the most important things I think God really wants us to get out of this idea of the Sabbath. And even though we as Christians today are not obligated to, we'll say, legally or ritualistically hold the Sabbath, it's still a necessity for us to have a time of rest, a time of ceasing. One of the things, I've got mixed emotions about hunting, because I do not like sitting in a tree in freezing cold weather, hoping and waiting for a deer to come by. Now, there are times and places and whatnot that there's hope and anticipation, and that's kind of neat that you have that there. But one thing that I've found is you're there in a tree or in a blind. You can't make a sound. What do? You are forced to think, to meditate, to listen to the world around you. You know, it's really fun. Annoying if you're hunting, but it's fun to watch squirrels come alive in the morning. You know, it's a mess if you're hunting because they, the sounds and whatnot. But it's neat to see life come alive in the morning. And to be there and not be able to make your own sound, not be able to engage in anything, but just to watch, just to experience. That's fantastic. And the same thing if you want to watch a sunset, a glorious sunset. You know, there are times you don't want to talk. You just want to soak it up. That's what Sabbath was. It was a time when you can soak up God and soak up each other. That's why, principally why, it was so important to God. He wants us to take that time. We need to take that time. And it establishes, it gives us an opportunity that we wouldn't otherwise take. We know that because we don't. But it forces us to have an opportunity to meditate on Him, to think through that relationship we have with Him. That's why Sabbath was such a big deal. And we know God is principally concerned about relationship. Does He like the fact that we outwardly worship? Absolutely. Does He like the fact that the Jews engaged in sacrifices, engaged in these activities, fasts? if done right, absolutely, he likes that fact. But he hates it if we're just doing it to do it. He wants that relationship. If the relationship's there, then he loves the activity. If the relationship is not there, the activity is pointless and he hates it. In fact, one place he vomits it out of his mouth. Okay, it's not worth it. So Sabbath, important. We aren't going to read these verses, but you get down to these verses, and again, they aren't paying any attention to the Sabbath. But Jesus says, hey, if you will pay attention to the Sabbath, if you will engage in the things you're supposed to engage in on the Sabbath, I will sustain you. If you don't, I'm going to cart you off to Babylon. Okay, that's where Jeremiah was. But we're going to talk next week about the flip side. What we talked about today is Sabbath from God's perspective. Why was it important? How did God approach it? We're going to talk next week about why was the Sabbath so important to Jewish leaders? What was their perspective about it, and what did they do with it? And I think this is important so that we can really understand what's going on here in Matthew 12. Why were the Pharisees hiding in the bushes and the disciples come by and pluck the grain and go, I caught you. That's a no-no. Why were they there in the first place? Why did they care? We're going to talk about that next week. All right, let's pray, and then we'll get back to it next week. Thank you, Father. Thank you for this time. Thank you for the words and the wisdom that you share with us through the text of the Bible. And thank you that we're in a country that gives us the liberty to open your word and to study it, to talk through it, and to engage in your word and in your will. Thank you, Father, for this group, for the ideas that are expressed and the great minds that we have here in this class. And we ask that you continue to sharpen our lives and our minds and our hearts in such a way that we can live your light and shine your light among the world around us, so that they can be the people around us can see you more clearly and love you more urgently. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. Thank you for the sacrifice he made for us. Help us to always live for him. It's through him we pray. Amen.